Napoleon abdicated on the 22nd of June in favor of his son Napoleon II. On the 24th of June the provisional government proclaimed the fact to the French nation and the world. After his defeat of the Battle of Waterloo, instead of remaining in the field with his shattered army, Napoleon returned to Paris in the hope of retaining political support for his position as Emperor of the French. With his political base secured, he hoped to then be able to continue the war. It was not to be. Instead, the members of the two chambers created a provisional government and demanded that Napoleon abdicate. Napoleon toyed with the idea of a coup d'état similar to 18th of Brumaire, but decided against it. On the 25th of June, Napoleon left Paris for the final time, and after staying at the Palace of Malmaison left for the coast, hoping to reach the United States of America. In the meantime, the provisional government deposed his son and tried to negotiate a conditional surrender with the coalition powers. They failed to obtain any significant concessions from the coalition, who insisted on a military surrender and the restoration of Louis XVIII. Napoleon, realizing he could not hope to evade the Royal Navy, surrendered to Captain Maitland. Upon placing himself under his protection on board HMS Bellerophon, the British government refused to allow Napoleon to set foot in England and arranged for his exile to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. Napoleon returned to Paris in the afternoon of the 21st of June. With the defeat at Waterloo, the enthrallment of the French people that had gripped them since Napoleon's return from exile rapidly dissipated, and they were forced to face the reality of several coalition armies advancing into France up to the gates of Paris. Had Napoleon flown towards the nearest French corps of Rapp and Lecourbe to lead them, along with all the reserves that he could possibly collect together, including the regimental depots, the GENSD, armory and even Dunkirk, against the flank of the victorious armies of the Duke of Wellington and Prince Blucher, during their hazardous advance upon the capital, and, in combination with forces of Marshal Soult and Grouchy, to effect their separation, perhaps their destruction. His commanders in the field pressed him to remain and continue to command in the field, but Napoleon calculated that if he did so, then the home front might capitulate to the coalition and undermine any successes he had in the field. Napoleon had said after his defeat in Russia that his presence in Paris confounded the skeptics. For the sword by which the empire had been raised and held in subjection, by which Europe itself had been mesmerized and all but conquered, had fallen powerless from his grasp. In him were no longer centered the might and the will of imperial France. These had been delegated through the Constitution to the organs of the nation, the elected representatives of the people. He no longer possessed, in his own person, the administrative and the executive, but was under the control of that power which, as before observed, when he left Paris to join the army, he dreaded more than the enemy he was going to confront, the power of French public opinion legitimately expressed. If he had so keenly felt its force before his downfall on the battlefield, how great, nay, how hopeless, must have appeared to him the task of endeavoring to soothe its excitement, and to obtain its sanction to renewed sacrifices, when suddenly appearing in Paris on the afternoon of the 21st of June, but 1 short week from the time of his assuming the command of his army, himself to announce the disastrous result of his enterprise. The imperialists in the capital, who had indulged in the most extravagant hopes engendered by the news of the victory at Ligny, had scarcely manifested their exultation when sinister rumors began to spread of some sudden reverses which had befallen the cause of Napoleon, and presently all doubts and suspense were removed by the unexpected appearance of the Emperor Napoleon himself, which gave rise to the most gloomy anticipations. Napoleon arrived in Paris only 2 hours after the news of the defeat at Waterloo had arrived. His arrival temporarily caused those who were conspiring against him to cease their machinations. Napoleon's calculated return to Paris may have been a political mistake, because it was seen by some as a desertion of his men and even an act of cowardice. If he had remained in the field, the nation might have rallied and perhaps fortune might have favoured him. Had the Chambers received the news of his defeat at Waterloo and moved to depose him, then the decrees might not have been followed by a nation still in arms. Mary, an Englishwoman living in France, who arrived in Paris shortly after the defeat, made the point that the French were now becoming used to regime changes and that these seemed to affect most of the populace no more than a change of government. In contemporary early 19th century Britain, not only had most of the civil servants kept their jobs, even some ministers had survived the regime changes, so many were disinclined to risk their lives or property for any regime. This was very different from the perceptions of the general populace that had accompanied the First Revolution and, after the Terror, Napoleon's subsequent usurpation. Cabinet deliberations. Napoleon immediately summoned a cabinet council. He frankly explained to his ministers the critical state of affairs, but, at the same time, with his usual confidence in his own resources, declared his conviction that if the nation were called upon to rise en masse, the annihilation of the enemy would follow, but that if, instead of ordering new levies and adopting extraordinary measures, the Chambers were to allow themselves to be drawn into debates, and to waste their time in disputation, all would be lost. Now that the enemy is in France, he added, it is necessary that I should be invested with extraordinary power, that of a temporary dictatorship, as a measure of safety for the country. I might assume this power, but it would be better and more national that it should be conferred upon me by the Chambers. The ministers were too well acquainted with the general views and disposition of the Chamber of Representatives to pronounce a direct approval of this step, but Napoleon, perceiving their hesitation, called upon them to express their opinion upon the measures of public safety required by existing circumstances. Lasserer, Count of Carnot, the Minister of the Interior, conceived it to lie essential that the country should be declared in danger, that the FEAQT and National Guards should be called to arms, that Paris should be placed in a stage of siege, and measures adopted for its defense, that at the last extremity the armed force should retire behind the Loire, and take up an entrenched position, that the army of La Vendée, where the civil war had nearly terminated, as also the corps of observation in the south, should be recalled, and the enemy checked until sufficient force could be united and organized for the assumption of a vigorous offensive, by which he should be driven out of France. Decrès, the Minister of the Navy, and Renaud de Saint-Jean d'Angely, the Secretary of State, supported this opinion, but Fouché, the Minister of Police, and the remaining ministers, remarked that the safety of the state did not depend upon any particular measure which might thus be proposed, but upon the Chambers of the Estates, and upon their uniting with the head of the government, and that by manifesting towards them confidence and good faith, they would be induced to declare it to be their duty to unite with Napoleon in the adoption of energetic measures for securing the honor and independence of the nation. Fouché's policy. This advice on the part of Fouché was an artful piece of dissimulation. No man in France possessed so intimate a knowledge of the secret workings of the public mind. He knew precisely the dispositions and views of the different factions, as also the character and temperament of their leaders. He knew also that the great parties in the Chambers, with the exception of the Imperialists, who were in the minority but whom he secretly flattered with the prospect of a Napoleon II, were fully prepared to depose the Emperor, in favor of full constitutional freedom and liberal institutions. This knowledge, obtained with an adroitness and a precision quite peculiar to this celebrated Minister of Police, he made completely subservient to his own personal views. These had been, from the commencement of Napoleon's second reign, to coquet with the factions in such a manner as to induce each to consider him an indispensable instrument in the realization of its hopes, and to exert this extraordinary influence either to support or to undermine the power of Napoleon, according as the fortunes of the latter might be in the ascendant or on the decline. The resolute attitude assumed by the Allies soon satisfied him that Although the emperor might once more dazzle the world with some brilliant feat of arms, he must eventually succumb to the fixed determination of the other sovereign powers to crush his usurped authority, and to the overwhelming masses, with which Europe was preparing to subjugate the country. He had been, and was still, in secret communication with the ministers and advisers of Louis XVIII, and was consequently in full possession of the general plans and intentions of the coalition powers. When, therefore, Napoleon's enterprise had so signally failed, and the reoccupation of Paris appeared to be its necessary consequence, Fouché foresaw clearly that were the proposed dictatorship to be assumed by means of a sudden and forced dissolution of the Chambers, implying that the recent reverses had been produced by treachery on the part of the representatives, and were new levies to be raised en masse in support of the force that yet remained available, the result would inevitably be anarchy and confusion in the capital, disorder and excesses throughout the whole country, renewed disasters to the nation, together with an awful and useless sacrifice of life. To prevent such a catastrophe, it was necessary to lull Napoleon's suspicions of the intentions of the Chambers, with which, at the same time, Fouché was fully acquainted. Hence it was that to gain sufficient time for the development of these intentions, Fouché gave to the council the advice before mentioned. Fouché strongly expressed his disapproval of the projected dissolution of the Chambers and assumption of the dictatorship, declaring that any measures of that kind would only turn to distrust, and, not improbably, a general revolt. But, at the same time, his agents were making known throughout Paris the fullest extent of the disasters that had befallen Napoleon, and which had caused his sudden and unexpected return, and the representatives were assembling in all haste, and in great numbers, to take a bold and decided step in the great national crisis. In thus dissembling from his master the real disposition of the great political parties, and the true state of the public mind, Fouché, no doubt, betrayed the trust reposed in him, but, setting aside the question whether he was really influenced by patriotic motives, or merely acting upon a system of deep duplicity and time-serving expediency, there can also be no doubt that, by pursuing the line of conduct which he did on this important occasion, he became the means of preserving his country from the infliction of a still further accumulation of evils. The Cabinet Council continued in discussion, some supporting, and others disapproving, the propositions of Napoleon, who, at length, yielding to the arguments of Fouché incarnate, declared he would submit himself to the loyalty of the Chambers, and confer with them as to the measures which the critical position of the country might render necessary. Resolutions of the Chamber of Representatives. In the meantime, the representatives had met, early on the 21st of June 1815, and commenced their deliberations on the existing state of affairs. Marquis de Lafayette, the acknowledged leader of the Liberal Party, having received intelligence of the subject of discussion in the Council, and aware that not a moment was to be lost in averting the blow with which their liberties were menaced, ascended the tribune, and addressed the chamber, amidst the most profound silence, and breathless suspense. Representatives, for the first time during many years you hear a voice, which the old friends of liberty will yet recognize. I rise to address you concerning the dangers to which the country is exposed. The sinister reports which have been circulated during the last 2 days, are unhappily confirmed. This is the moment to rally round the national colours, the tricolored standard of 1788, the standard of liberty, equality, and public order. It is you alone who can now protect the country from foreign attacks, and internal dissensions. It is you alone who can secure the independence and the honour of France. Permit a veteran in the sacred cause of liberty, in all times a stranger to the spirit of faction, to submit to you some resolutions which appear to him to be demanded by a sense of the public danger, and by the love of our country. They are such as, I feel persuaded, you will see the necessity of adopting. The Chamber of Deputies declares that the independence of the nation is menaced. 2. The Chamber declares its sittings permanent. Any attempt to dissolve it shall be considered high treason. Whosoever shall render himself culpable of such an attempt shall be considered a traitor to his country, and immediately treated as such. 3. The Army of the Line, and the National Guards, who have fought, and still fight, for the liberty, the independence, and the territory of France, have merited well of the country. IV. The Minister of the Interior is invited to assemble the principal officers of the Parisian National Guard, in order to consult on the means of providing it with arms, and of completing the score of citizens, whose tried patriotism and zeal offer a sure guarantee for the liberty, prosperity, and tranquility of the capital, and for the inviolability of the national representatives. V. The Ministers of War, of Foreign Affairs, of Police, and of the Interior are invited to repair immediately to the sittings of the Chamber. No one ventured to oppose these bold resolutions. The Imperialist party was taken by surprise. The leading members were now elsewhere with Napoleon Bonaparte, and the others had not the courage to face the impending storm, and, after a brief discussion, in which their instant adoption was urged in the strongest manner, they were carried by acclamation, with the exception of the fourth, which was suspended on account of the invidious distinction which it appeared to convey between the troops of the line and the National Guards. They were then transmitted to the Chamber of Peers, where, after a short discussion, they were adopted without amendment. Further cabinet discussions. The message from the Chambers, conveying these resolutions, reached the Council in the midst of its deliberations. Napoleon was staggered by an act which he looked upon as an usurpation of the sovereign authority. To him, who had so long exercised an almost unlimited control in the state, who had led mighty armies to victory, and who had subjected powerful nations to his despotic sway, this sudden and energetic voice of the people, conveyed through the medium of their representatives, aroused him to a full sense of the wonderful change which had been effected in the public mind, and in his own individual position, through the intervention of a constitution. He was alike indignant at what he conceived to be a daring presumption, and mortified at his own miscalculation in having convoked the Chambers. J'avais bien penché, he remarked, que j'aurais dû congédier ces gens were avant mon départ.